I've been thinking about that weekend for years now, and it still feels strange every time I replay it in my mind. It started off as a simple plan, just me and my partner wanting to get away from the city, from the noise and the stress. We found this cabin deep in the woods, far off the beaten path, where we could spend a quiet weekend. The pictures looked cozy. A small wooden cabin surrounded by tall trees, a creek nearby, and no neighbors for miles. Sounded perfect. When we arrived late Friday afternoon, the air was already cool and smelled of pine and wet earth. The road leading to the cabin was narrow and dusty, lined with thick trees that blocked out most of the fading sunlight. By the time we pulled up, the sky was turning a dull orange, and the forest around us looked quiet, almost too quiet. The cabin itself was made of rough-hewn logs, with a stone chimney and a small porch. It looked exactly like the photos, maybe even better in person. The owner, a woman in her late 50s or early 60s, met us at the door. She was friendly but reserved, with pale skin and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything. She handed us the keys and gave us a few brief instructions: how to start the wood stove, where the firewood was stacked, how to use the old well water for drinking. Then she mentioned the guest book. She said it was a tradition that every guest who stayed in the cabin signed it, and we should do the same. It was inside on a small wooden table near the entrance, bound in a thick leather cover with yellowed pages inside. We thanked her and told her we'd settle in. She left with a small wave, and the door closed behind her with a soft click. The inside of the cabin smelled like wood smoke and something else, maybe dust and old fabric. The ceiling beams were dark and rough, and the furniture was simple but sturdy. A small kitchen with a cast iron stove, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a couch with worn cushions, and a single bedroom off to the side. The windows were small but looked out onto the trees all around. After unpacking, we sat down at the table and opened the guest book. It was heavy, the pages thick and soft from years of use. The entries went back decades, some from the early 1950s, others more recent into the 1980s and 90s, with neat handwriting, scribbled notes, and a few drawings. It was like a little history of everyone who had stayed here, their names, dates, and sometimes a few words about their stay. As I flipped through the pages, I noticed something strange. Near the end of the book, the entries suddenly slowed down. There was a block of pages filled with names that stopped abruptly. The last signature was dated about 10 years ago. That was odd because the owner had said she rented the cabin regularly, and here we were, supposedly the current guests. But there was no entry after that last one from a decade ago. I showed the guest book to my partner. We both found it weird but didn't think too much of it at the time. Maybe the owner just forgot to give out the book, or maybe some guests didn't bother signing it. Still, it felt off. That first night, after we lit the wood stove and ate dinner, we settled in. The cabin was quiet, but as the night deepened, strange things started to happen. I heard noises, soft knocks on the wooden walls, the creaking of old beams, and at times a cold draft that swept through the room despite all the windows and doors being shut tight. It was the kind of cold that made your skin prickle, like something unseen had passed through. My partner noticed it too. We checked the windows and doors several times. Everything was locked. I tried to ignore the noises and the cold drafts, but they kept happening. Every now and then, there was the faint sound of footsteps outside, crunching leaves or twigs breaking. But when we looked out the windows, there was no one. The woods were still, dark, and empty. We both felt uneasy but chalked it up to the cabin being old and in the middle of nowhere. Old buildings make noises, especially at night, and the wind through the trees can sound like footsteps. We tried to relax, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I woke up early. The sun was just rising, painting the forest in soft pinks and oranges. The cabin felt different in daylight, warm and less threatening. I went back to the guest book to look more closely at those last few pages. The entries from 10 years ago were just names and dates, no messages, nothing to explain why it stopped. Curious, I decided to take some photos of the pages to show the owner later. Maybe she'd have some answers. When my partner woke up, I showed them the pictures. They looked puzzled too. We spent the day exploring the woods around the cabin, hiking a short trail that led to the creek. The forest was dense, the air fresh, and the silence peaceful except for birdsong and the occasional rustling of small animals. The quiet was almost a relief after the strange noises of the night before. That evening, after another cold draft and some more noises, we finally decided to ask the owner about the guest book. She had agreed to meet us at the cabin around dinner time to drop off some extra firewood and check on things. When she arrived, her face was pale. I showed her the guest book and the section where the names stopped 10 years ago. I asked if she knew why no one had signed it since then, even though she rented the cabin regularly. She looked down for a moment, then back up with a serious expression. She said the cabin had been empty for years, not rented or used, but she kept the book as a tradition. She said she hadn't expected anyone to come back or want to stay. It was like a family heirloom now, a memory of the past. That didn't make sense. We were there. We had the keys. We had stayed in the cabin. But if the owner hadn't rented it, how did we get the keys? How did the place get cleaned and ready? We pressed no further. The owner seemed uneasy, and we didn't want to upset her. That night, we looked again at the guest book. The pages were blank after the last entries from 10 years ago, but the book felt heavier, as if the weight of those years filled the room. Then we noticed something that made the blood drain from our faces. The names we had signed on the first day were missing. Our signatures were gone, erased as if we had never been there. We searched the entire book, page by page, multiple times. The pages were yellowed and fragile, but the ink from decades ago was still visible. Our handwriting was nowhere to be found. We tried to convince ourselves it was a trick of memory, but we both remembered clearly signing the guest book when we arrived. The name, the date, our short message. But the book told a different story. We packed up quickly the next morning. The air felt colder, heavier. The woods seemed darker, the silence louder. On the drive back, we talked about what had happened. We realized the cabin had not been rented for years. The owner was renting it out in name only, maybe for money or out of habit. The guest book was a relic, never used by guests in recent years. But then how had we gotten in? How had we stayed there? And how had our signatures disappeared? It dawned on us that the cabin itself had become isolated, cut off from time somehow, a place where guests never truly arrived or stayed. The owner was renting it, but no one actually used it anymore. We understood then the strange noises and cold drafts, not supernatural, but the natural decay of an empty building. The wind through cracks, the old wood settling and creaking. The isolation played tricks on us, made the silence oppressive and the shadows deeper. We never went back. The cabin, the guest book, the missing names. It all fit together in a quiet, unsettling truth. The cabin was abandoned in everything but name. We were the last visitors, though our presence was erased, just like the years that had passed since anyone truly stayed there. It was a weekend getaway that never really happened. The first thing I noticed about the Airbnb was how quiet everything was. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the heavy, unnatural kind that seemed to press in on me from every side. It was late afternoon when I arrived, and the small town where the house was located felt almost empty, like a place that time forgot. I'd booked the place on a whim, needing to get away from the noise and chaos of the city for a few days. The listing promised a cozy cabin retreat and showed pictures of a neat, two-story wooden house surrounded by trees. It looked perfect online, simple, clean, and remote. What I didn't realize was just how isolated remote really meant. The driveway was a rough gravel path that curved between dense stands of pine and fir trees. I had to drive slow because the gravel was loose, and the tires kicked up dust that hung in the still air. When I finally pulled up to the house, I got out and looked around. The sun was already dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows that made everything look darker than it really was. The house itself was old but well-maintained. The wood siding stained a deep brown, with a porch that wrapped around the front. There was a single porch light that flickered faintly, struggling to stay on. Inside, the house smelled like wood and something faintly musty. It had that old house feeling where the air feels a little thick and stale, like it hadn't been opened up properly in a while. The floors creaked under my feet, and the windows were slightly fogged, but the place was clean. I unpacked slowly, trying to settle in, But even as I moved around, I felt the weight of the silence. There were no sounds from neighbors, no distant traffic or birds chirping, nothing but the quiet hum of the house itself. I tried to distract myself by exploring the house. The kitchen was small but had everything I needed. A stove, a tiny fridge, some basic dishes and silverware neatly stacked in cabinets. The living room had a couch and a few chairs, and a TV mounted on the wall, though the remote didn't seem to work. Upstairs, there were 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. The windows in the bedrooms looked out onto the thick forest, but the glass was old and slightly warped, making everything outside look blurry. That night, after eating a simple dinner of canned soup and bread, I sat on the porch, hoping to soak up some fresh air. The sky was clear, and the stars were sharp and bright. The silence outside was total, like the forest itself was holding its breath. After a while, I went back inside, locked the doors, and tried to watch some TV, but it was just static. I ended up reading a book by flashlight in the living room, but I kept hearing small noises, creaks, thuds, the faintest scratching sound from upstairs. The scratching sound kept me awake longer than I wanted. It wasn't consistent. Sometimes it would stop for long minutes, then start again, light and soft like nails dragging across wood or maybe a branch scraping the side of the house. I told myself it was nothing, probably just the house settling or the wind outside, even though there was no wind at all. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell asleep. The next morning, I woke early and made coffee in the tiny kitchen. The sun was still low, and the house was starting to warm up with the light. I opened a window in the living room to let in fresh air, and for a moment, the silence felt less heavy. I could hear faint sounds from the forest, the snap of a twig, a distant bird call. It felt like the place might come alive during the day. I decided to explore the area a bit. The house was perched on a slight hill, and behind it, the forest stretched for miles. There was a narrow trail that looked like it hadn't been used much, just a dirt path covered in fallen leaves and pine needles. I followed it for a while, trying to clear my head. The trees were tall and close together, and the air smelled fresh but damp. After walking about 15 minutes, I came to a small clearing with a stream running through it. The water was clear and cold, trickling over smooth stones. I stayed there for a while, watching the water and listening to the quiet splash of the stream. It felt peaceful, and for a moment, I thought maybe this trip would be just what I needed. On my way back, I noticed something strange. The trail I had taken didn't seem to match the map I had printed from the Airbnb listing. The map showed a small pond nearby, but I didn't see it anywhere. Instead, the trail looped back to the house through dense forest, and I realized I'd lost my sense of direction more than once. When I got back, I double-checked the house. All the doors were locked, the windows closed, but I still felt uneasy. The scratching noise was back, this time more persistent. It wasn't coming from the roof or outside. It sounded like it was inside the walls or maybe the ceiling. I tried to ignore it, but every time I sat down, it started again, slow and steady. That evening, I prepared dinner, but I was too distracted to enjoy it. The house felt colder than before, even with the heater running. The silence was thick, almost suffocating. I kept glancing at the windows, feeling like something was watching me from the trees. I know it sounds crazy, but there was a feeling of being followed or stalked that I couldn't shake. Around midnight, I woke to a loud bang. It was sharp and sudden, like someone had slammed a heavy door upstairs. I froze for a moment, listening. The house was still except for the faint creaking of the floorboards. My heart was pounding. I told myself it was probably just the wind knocking something over, but the windows were closed tight. I grabbed my phone and tried to call someone, anyone, but there was no signal, no bars at all. I checked the router for the Wi-Fi, but the internet was dead. I felt completely cut off. I moved cautiously toward the stairs, the house groaning under my footsteps. The banging came again, this time softer, like something tapping on the wall. I reached the top of the stairs and looked down the hallway. The scratching sound was louder here. It was coming from the bedroom at the end. My hands trembled as I pushed the door open. The room was empty except for a bed, a dresser, and a small window. The scratching stopped as soon as I entered. I searched the room carefully. Nothing looked out of place, no sign of anything or anyone else. I even checked under the bed. The window was locked tight. I was about to leave when I noticed something on the floor near the closet. A small pile of wood shavings, like someone had been carving or scraping something. I pulled open the closet door, half expecting to find a raccoon or some kind of animal. But the closet was empty except for some old coats and a dusty box. I sat on the bed, trying to calm down, but the feeling of unease didn't leave me. I went back downstairs and locked all the doors again. I stayed up the rest of the night with a flashlight, staring out the windows, listening for any sound. The scratching didn't come back, but the silence was worse. The next morning, I decided I wasn't going to stay longer. I packed up quickly and checked out. As I drove away, I looked back at the house through the rearview mirror. It looked normal in the daylight, just a quiet cabin in the woods. But I knew I'd never come back. It wasn't ghosts or fairy tales that made the place scary. It was the total, suffocating silence, the feeling of being watched, the strange noises that didn't make sense. It was the kind of fear that crawls into your skin when you're all alone and cut off from the world. The house didn't have to be haunted for it to feel wrong. Sometimes just being so isolated, surrounded by endless trees and no other people, is enough. When I finally got back to the city, I couldn't stop thinking about that house. It was the kind of place where the mind starts playing tricks, where every creak and scratch makes you jump. But I also realized it taught me something. Fear doesn't always come from what you see or hear. Sometimes it's the silence, the emptiness, the unknown waiting just beyond the window. I don't regret going there. Even though it was one of the scariest experiences of my life, I learned to trust my instincts, to respect the quiet that's too deep, and to know when to walk away. The Airbnb was just a house in the woods, but for a few days it was a place that reminded me how real fear can be, without any ghosts or monsters, just the simple, terrifying feeling of being alone in a world that doesn't answer back. I parked my old truck on the gravel road that led up to the cabin. The sun was just starting to sink behind the hills, casting long shadows through the dense forest. The trees stood tall and close together, like a wall of green and brown stretching as far as I could see. The air was cool but not cold, carrying the faint smell of pine and wet earth. I had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks, a quiet break from the city noise and the endless emails. Just me, the cabin, and the forest. The cabin was small and simple, made of weathered wood that looked like it had been there for decades. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by thick woods. The windows were dirty and streaked, but I could see the basic furniture inside. A worn sofa, a small wooden table, and a stove that looked like it might still work. I threw my pack on the ground and unlocked the heavy door, which creaked as it swung open. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of dust and old wood. I pulled the curtains back to let in the last of the light and set about unpacking. I had brought enough food and water for a few days, some books, and my old camping gear. No phone service here, no internet, no distractions. Just silence and the forest. As night fell, I built a fire in the stone fireplace. The flames crackled and popped, sending sparks up the chimney. The room filled with a warm orange glow, and I settled into the sofa with a book. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves and branches. The occasional hoot of an owl or the distant bark of a coyote broke the quiet. I was halfway through a chapter when I heard it, a soft noise outside, like something scraping against the side of the cabin. My heart skipped. I set the book down and listened. The noise stopped, then started again a few minutes later. It was faint, almost like nails or claws scratching on wood. I got up and peered out the window, but it was too dark to see anything clearly. The fire was low now, and shadows danced across the walls. I shook my head and tried to tell myself it was probably just a tree branch or an animal passing by, maybe a raccoon or a deer. I went to bed early that night, but sleep didn't come easy. Every small sound made me jump. A twig snapping, the wind whistling through the cracks in the cabin walls. I kept thinking about that scratching noise, and I wasn't sure if it had really been there or if I had imagined it. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside, slow, deliberate steps moving around the cabin. I froze, listening as the footsteps circled the building once, then stopped. For a moment, everything was silent again. Then the footsteps started moving away, fading into the distance. I lay there, heart pounding, waiting for more sounds, but there was only the steady rhythm of my breathing and the soft whistle of the wind. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, I woke early and went outside. The forest was bright and still, the sun filtering through the branches. I walked around the cabin, looking for signs of what had been there the night before. On the ground near the back door, I found deep scratches gouged into the wood frame. They were fresh, the wood splintered and raw. I didn't know what had made them, but I felt a cold knot in my stomach. Someone or something had been here close enough to touch the cabin, close enough to see me. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, then went back inside. All day, I tried to focus on simple tasks. I cleaned the cabin, stacked firewood, and explored the nearby trails. The forest was beautiful, full of tall trees and moss-covered rocks. Birds sang in the branches above, and a small creek ran nearby. It was peaceful, but there was always that edge of unease, like I was being watched. That evening, I decided to make dinner outside, using the small grill near the fire pit. The sun was setting, turning the sky a deep red. As I cooked, I kept glancing toward the tree line, expecting to see movement, but there was nothing. After dinner, I sat by the fire again, reading and listening to the night sounds. The scratching noise didn't come back, but something else did. The footsteps, slow, heavy steps just beyond the clearing. They moved in a circle like the night before, stopping and starting. I didn't want to look, but I had to know. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the edge of the clearing, shining the beam into the trees. The light caught on something, a figure standing still, just beyond the shadows. I couldn't make out any details, just a shape. I called out, but there was no answer. The figure melted back into the trees. I ran back to the cabin, slammed the door, and locked it tight. My hands were shaking. I checked the windows again, then sat down by the fire, trying to calm myself. The forest was alive with noises, but none of them felt normal anymore. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat by the fire until it burned low, then lay on the sofa, fully dressed, a knife on the table beside me. Every sound made me tense. The wind, the animals, the footsteps that I thought I heard circling the cabin again. At dawn, I made a plan. I would leave. Not tomorrow, not when the sun was up, but now. I packed my things quietly, trying not to wake any animals or alert whoever or whatever had been outside. I unlocked the door and stepped out into the early morning light. The forest was still and quiet, but the air felt heavy. As I started walking down the gravel road toward my truck, I looked back at the cabin one last time. The scratches on the wood were sharp and jagged, like claws. I shivered. I reached the truck and climbed in. The engine roared to life and I drove away fast, not stopping until I was back on the main highway, surrounded by other cars and people. I didn't look back again. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know who or what was out there in the woods, but I learned something important that weekend. Sometimes the quiet and the stillness aren't peaceful. Sometimes they're a warning. And when you hear footsteps outside your door in the middle of the night, it's best to listen. Because whatever is there won't always stay quiet. The cabin was supposed to be a perfect escape. My wife, Rachel, and I had been planning this little trip for months. We were both exhausted from work, city noise, and everything that comes with living in a crowded place. The cabin sat deep in the woods, far away from anything. No shops, no neighbors, no distractions. Just us, the forest, and silence. When we arrived, the sky was already getting dark, but the sun still peeked through the tall pine trees. The gravel road ended at a small clearing where the cabin stood. It was old, but well-maintained, with wooden beams and a stone chimney. The porch creaked slightly under our feet as we stepped inside. The smell of pine and old wood filled the air. The place had a certain charm, nothing fancy, but cozy enough for two people to relax. One thing we noticed right away was the lack of cell phone reception. Rachel tried her phone near the window, but there was nothing. No bars, no signal, just a blank screen. I checked mine and it was the same. We shrugged it off. We wanted a break from the constant buzzing of notifications anyway. The first night was peaceful. We lit the fireplace, made some dinner, and talked about how nice it was to get away. No emails, no calls, no texts, just us and the quiet. Around 10 p.m., Rachel's phone suddenly rang. It was odd because we both knew there shouldn't be any reception. She looked at the screen. An unknown number, one neither of us recognized. She hesitated but answered it anyway, curiosity getting the better of her. All she heard was heavy breathing. Not loud, but steady, close, and unsettling. No words, no background noise, just that slow, heavy breath over and over. I watched her face tighten, eyes narrowing. She said nothing, just hung up. The moment she did, she tried calling the number back, but the line was disconnected immediately. The phone showed number not in service. She frowned and turned the phone off for the rest of the night. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe some weird glitch or a prank call, but with no reception, it made no sense. How did the call even get through? The next morning, we talked about it over coffee. Rachel was unsettled but tried to brush it off. I suggested it could be a pocket dial or some signal interference from a distant tower. We agreed not to worry and planned to spend the day hiking. Over the next couple of days, strange things started happening. The phone calls came back, always late at night or very early in the morning, when the cabin was dark and silent except for the forest sounds outside. Rachel's phone would ring, showing the same unknown number. When she answered, there was only the heavy breathing again. No other noise, no words. First, she would hang up immediately. Then she started leaving the phone on speaker, trying to hear if there was anything else. But nothing changed. The breathing was steady, like someone was just holding the phone up to their mouth and breathing heavily, maybe trying to scare us. She tried blocking the number, but it still came through. Sometimes the phone would ring twice in a row, sometimes just once. The calls were always at odd hours, sometimes just after midnight, other times around 4 a.m. or even 6 a.m., right when we were trying to fall asleep or just waking up. We both grew tired and tense. It was impossible to sleep well. Every time the phone rang, our hearts jumped. We never knew when it would come, but we feared it every time. Rachel's mood changed. She became quiet, sometimes jumpy, staring at her phone like it might suddenly scream or whisper something at her. I started checking the cabin more closely, looking for anything out of place. The windows were all locked, no signs of anyone around. The door to the cabin had a solid deadbolt. There was no way anyone could have been near us without us hearing them. We even checked the phone's call logs. The number was always the same, never changed. Yet every time we called it back, it was disconnected or didn't exist. On the third night, things got worse. The call came just after 2 a.m. Rachel's phone rang sharply, breaking the silence. I was already half awake, and the sudden sound made me sit up. She answered, the breathing was there again. But this time, it wasn't just breathing. It was heavier, harsher, like someone was struggling to breathe. It felt different, more urgent, but still no words. She hung up and looked at me with wide eyes, shaking her head. I told her to turn the phone off and put it in my backpack. We sat in silence by the fireplace, listening to the crackling flames. Outside, the wind blew through the trees, and an owl hooted somewhere in the distance. It was peaceful, but inside the cabin, the tension grew. By the next morning, we agreed that we couldn't stay any longer. The calls had ruined the peace we came for. There was no explanation, no way to stop it, and no one to call for help since there was no reception. As we packed, I found something strange on the porch. A small, crumpled piece of paper tucked under the welcome mat. I unfolded it carefully. It had a series of numbers written on it, like a phone number, but scratched out and nearly unreadable. Beneath it, a short message, "Stop looking." I showed it to Rachel and her face turned pale. We knew then that whoever was behind the calls was close. The message wasn't a prank. It was a warning. We loaded our bags into the car quickly and started the engine. The gravel crunched under the tires as we drove away, the cabin disappearing behind us into the woods. On the way back to town, I tried calling the number again, just to be sure. It was still disconnected. We never found out who made those calls or why. No one else seemed to have had the same experience in that area. The cabin owners never mentioned anything when I called later to explain why we left early. To this day, Rachel's phone still shows the unknown number in the blocked list. Neither of us will ever forget those nights filled with heavy breathing on the line, calls that came from nowhere, and a warning that made it clear we were not welcome. We never went back, and I hope we never will. Sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. They're just the unknown, the people who want to remind you that you're being watched, and the silence that follows heavy breathing on the other end of a phone you thought was dead. The weekend started off exactly how I had hoped. Quiet, peaceful, and far away from everything. I had rented a small cabin deep in the woods, tucked away from the noise of the city, to escape the constant rush of my daily life. The plan was simple: spend a couple of days alone, read, relax, maybe go for some hikes if I felt like it. I wanted to disconnect, recharge. I never expected to feel this uneasy or to want to leave so quickly. The cabin itself was old but well kept, built mostly of dark wood that had weathered over time. It stood on a slight clearing surrounded by tall pines that creaked in the wind. I pulled up in my car late Friday afternoon. The road was narrow and bumpy, but I made it without incident. When I stepped inside, the smell of pine mixed with faint dust hit me immediately. The cabin was simple but cozy. There was a small kitchen, a living room with a wood stove, and a bedroom off to the side. The big mirror on one wall of the living room caught my eye right away. It was nearly floor to ceiling, framed in dark oak, and stood opposite the window, reflecting the forest outside. It made the space feel bigger, but something about it also made me pause, as if it was watching. At first, I dismissed the feeling. I put down my bags and started unpacking. The air inside was cooler than outside, probably because the windows were all closed to keep out bugs and the chilly evening air. I brewed some coffee, sat down on the couch, and looked around. Everything was peaceful. The sounds outside were normal: birds, the wind in the trees. Nothing unusual. That night, I fell asleep easily. The quiet was a welcome change from the constant hum of the city. But the next morning, I noticed something strange. I was brushing my hair in front of the big mirror when I saw my reflection lag behind me for a moment. It was subtle, but the mirror didn't quite match my movements perfectly. At first, I thought I was imagining it, or maybe my eyes were just tired. I waved my hand, expecting to see the reflection wave back. Instead, the reflection just stared at me. Not a normal staring, but a blank, still look. No movement. I froze, blinking several times. Then I waved again. Nothing. The reflection didn't move at all. I stepped back, heart pounding a little. This didn't make sense. The room was empty except for me. The light was good, and the mirror was clear. I tested again, moving my arm slowly, then quickly. The reflection was there, but not copying me properly. It was as if it was disconnected. I told myself it was a trick of the light, or maybe the glass was old and warped. The mirror was big, after all, and had probably been there for decades. But the feeling lingered, a cold knot of fear twisting in my stomach. I decided to stay away from it and focus on other things. Throughout the day, I noticed small things that unsettled me more. The mirror would catch my eye when I wasn't looking directly at it. Sometimes I'd glance and see the reflection not quite lining up with reality. Once, I saw my reflection sitting on the couch while I was standing near the window. It made no sense. I even took my phone out to record it, hoping to catch the lag. But when I played it back, everything looked normal. No lag, no frozen images. Just me moving in sync with my reflection. I slept with the curtains drawn that night, trying to block out any strange shadows from the woods. But the mirror still sat there, silent and unblinking. The next morning was colder, and there was a thick mist hanging over the trees. I woke early and walked into the living room to make coffee. The cabin was quiet except for the soft hiss of the stove heating up. When I looked over at the mirror, my breath caught in my throat. The glass was fogged, but from the inside, it looked like someone had been breathing on it from behind. I blinked, stepping closer. The fog was uneven, like a hand had brushed across part of it. I put my fingers on the glass to wipe it, but there was nothing behind it. The mirror was flush against the wall. There was no way anyone could be behind it. It was mounted solid, no gap or space. I tried to shake it off as a weird condensation effect. Maybe the humidity from outside and the warmth inside was causing it. But something didn't feel right. The fog pattern almost looked like a face, or at least part of one, an eye or a mouth pressed up against the glass. It faded after a few minutes, but the chill stayed. I packed up my things that morning. The plan to stay the whole weekend vanished with the fogged mirror. I didn't want to ignore the feeling, the subtle warning that something wasn't right. Before leaving, I stopped at the small general store on the way back out of the area. I asked the owner about the cabin, trying to sound casual. She hesitated, then told me the cabin had belonged to a man who disappeared several years ago. No one knew exactly what happened to him. Some said he left suddenly, others that he vanished without a trace. The place had been empty for a long time before it was rented out again. Driving away, I kept looking in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something watching me from the woods. But all I saw was the empty road stretching behind me. I haven't gone back. I don't know what I saw in that mirror or why it didn't move like me. Maybe it was just an old glass with strange reflections, or my mind playing tricks when I was alone. But I know one thing for sure. There was something about that cabin, something I couldn't explain, and I wasn't going to wait around to find out what it was. It started on a cool autumn afternoon when a group of 5 friends and I rented a cabin deep in the woods. The place was supposed to be perfect for a weekend getaway. Quiet, isolated, and far from the noise of the city. The cabin looked sturdy enough from the outside, built with old dark wood that had weathered years of wind and rain. The porch was covered in dry leaves, and the smell of pine filled the air. We were excited to escape and just relax, cook some food, and enjoy the peaceful forest. When we first walked inside, the cabin felt cozy but a little old. The wooden floor creaked under our boots, and the faint smell of dust and old wood hit us as we entered. The windows were thick, and the sunlight made the dust in the air shine like tiny stars. There were 2 rooms, a living area with a fireplace and a small kitchen. Then there was a narrow hallway leading to 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. Everything looked worn but clean enough for a weekend stay. Near the kitchen, there was a door that caught my attention. It was different from the others, sturdier, made of heavy wood with no windows or glass panels, and locked tight with an old metal lock. It looked like it hadn't been opened in a long time. I asked the owner about it when we met him outside before we went inside. He said it was just for storage and there was nothing inside, so he didn't bother giving us the key. He seemed to brush it off like it was nothing important. We all laughed about it at first, making jokes about what could possibly be behind the door. But the curiosity lingered. None of us knew what was in there, and the owner's dismissive answer didn't help. We wanted to see inside, but with no key, there was no way. Still, the door's presence made the cabin feel different somehow, like there was a part of the place locked away, hidden from us. That evening, after unpacking and having dinner, we all gathered around the fireplace, the flames casting warm shadows on the walls. The air outside had turned colder, and the trees outside whispered with the wind. As night fell, I couldn't stop thinking about that door. Something about it felt off. Curiosity got the better of me, so I tried to look through the crack under the door. The lock made it almost impossible to open, but there was a tiny gap at the bottom. I knelt down, careful not to make noise, and peeked through. At first, all I could see was darkness and dust. Then, faintly, I thought I heard something slow, shallow breathing. It was so quiet I wasn't sure if my mind was playing tricks on me. I looked again, listening hard. There it was, that soft, uneven breath coming from inside the locked room. I stepped back quietly, heart pounding. I told the others what I heard, but no one believed me. They joked it was the wind or maybe some old heating pipes creaking in the walls. But I knew what I heard. It was breathing, real breathing, coming from behind that door. Later that night, when everyone else was asleep, I lay in my bed wide awake. The cabin was silent except for the occasional creak of the wood and the distant sounds of night animals. Then, I heard it, a faint scratching noise coming from behind the locked door. Slow and deliberate, like someone or something was scraping their nails or claws against the wood. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent. The sound made my skin crawl. I got up and pressed my ear to the door, holding my breath. The scratching stopped for a moment, then started again. I backed away slowly, feeling the panic rise. The room felt colder suddenly, like a shadow had passed over the air. I didn't tell anyone, afraid they'd think I was imagining things. The next morning, when the sun finally came through the windows, we all got up and started packing. Something about the night had changed the mood. We were quieter, less relaxed. I went to check the locked door again, and my heart jumped. It was slightly open, just a little, maybe an inch or two. I pushed it slowly, expecting to see some empty storage room, or maybe old tools and boxes. But the room was empty. Nothing but dust and old cobwebs. There was no sign of anyone or anything. No footprints, no objects, no evidence of movement. Just an empty, dark space. The air inside smelled stale, like it hadn't been opened in years. I called the others to look, but they just shrugged and said maybe the wind had pushed the door open. But the cabin's interior was tight and closed, and the door was heavy. It seemed impossible for wind alone to open it. We left soon after, feeling a strange unease. The whole weekend that was supposed to be fun and relaxing felt like a nightmare we barely understood. I tried not to think about the breathing or the scratching, but it stuck with me. Weeks later, out of curiosity, I searched for any information about the cabin. I found a review from the previous renters who had stayed there a few months before us. They wrote about hearing noises behind that door, but said they never stayed the whole night because the sound scared them away. They never explained what was inside, and no one else had answers. The owner never spoke about the door again, and no one could tell me why it was locked or what was kept in that room. The mystery stayed with me, more real than any ghost story. It wasn't about ghosts or spirits. It was something else, something human or maybe something left behind. The cabin was old, surrounded by dense forest, far from help or other people. I started thinking maybe someone had used that room to hide something, maybe a trapped animal or worse, a person. The breathing I heard could have been a person hiding or locked in there once, and the scratching was a desperate attempt to get out. Whatever it wasn't a friendly secret. The fact the owner didn't want us to see inside made me wonder if they knew what was behind that door all along. When we found the room empty the next day, maybe whoever or whatever was there had been taken away, or maybe it was just hiding too well. The whole experience left me with an uneasy feeling about that cabin. Some places hold memories and secrets not meant for visitors, and sometimes those secrets don't want to be found. I never went back, and I don't think I will. That locked door remains a mystery, a silent warning to anyone who might stay there again. It's a reminder that not every locked door is empty behind it, and sometimes it's better not to know what's waiting on the other side. I rented the cabin for a few days to get away from everything: work, people, noise. It was one of those small, old cabins tucked deep in the woods, far from the nearest town. The kind you find by accident if you take the wrong turn on a dirt road and keep driving until the pavement ends. I had the address from a website where people rented out private cabins, usually for hunting or fishing trips. The photos showed a modest, weathered building with a porch and a wood stove inside. Nothing fancy, but it promised quiet and solitude. I arrived late afternoon and found the place exactly as described. A single story, rough pine boards on the outside, windows clouded with dust and grime from the last storm. A thin layer of moss covered parts of the roof. The porch creaked under my feet as I stepped out of the truck and locked the door behind me. The owner had left a key in a box nailed to a tree, just like the instructions said. No one was around. The silence was heavy. Not the peaceful kind, but that kind that feels like the forest is watching you, waiting. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and damp earth. The windows barely let any light through, and I could see dust floating in the air. The furniture was sparse and worn. A wooden table, 2 chairs, a small bed with a thin mattress, and the wood stove sitting cold in the corner. I stacked some firewood near it, hoping to make a fire later when the temperature dropped. I spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking my things, then went for a short walk around the property. The cabin was surrounded by thick trees, mostly pines and firs, so close that I could barely see more than 50 feet in any direction. The ground was littered with pine needles, small rocks, and fallen branches. It was quiet except for the occasional rustle of a squirrel or bird. I kept checking my phone for signal but got nothing. No surprise, I expected it. That first night, I went to bed early, hoping to catch up on rest. The cabin was cold, so I built a small fire in the stove and sat close, reading an old paperback I had brought along. As darkness fell, the forest outside turned into a shadowy wall, and I started hearing the usual night sounds. Distant owls, the rustling of leaves, maybe a deer moving through the brush. Nothing unusual. Around midnight, I was just about to turn off the light and sleep when I heard it. Footsteps on the porch. At first, I thought maybe the owner was coming by to check on the place or bring something. I called out, "Hello?" but got no answer. The footsteps stopped for a moment, then moved slowly along the edge of the porch, pacing back and forth. It was the sound of heavy boots or shoes pressing on the wooden floorboards, deliberate and slow, not like an animal or a small person running. I stayed still, listening closely. The door was locked tight, and I could see the bolt in place from where I sat by the stove. Whoever was out there couldn't get in without breaking something or having a key. The footsteps circled the cabin, moving from one side to the other, always just out of reach of the windows. Every step echoed in the silence, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried calling out again, but no answer came. The footsteps stopped suddenly, just outside one of the windows facing the woods. I held my breath, eyes fixed on the glass. The window was old and slightly foggy, but I thought I caught a shadow, a figure standing very still. Then it moved, a slow step back, and the footsteps resumed, retreating around the cabin's edge and disappearing into the darkness. I stayed up the rest of the night, pacing between the porch and the small living space, checking the locks, the windows, everything. I didn't sleep much, and when dawn finally crept through the trees, I was exhausted and jumpy. The next morning, I stepped outside to look for clues about who had been on the porch. The ground was damp with dew and soft from the previous night's rain, making footprints easy to spot. Near the porch, I saw a set of fresh prints. Heavy boots, maybe size 11 or 12. They circled the cabin, matching the pattern I had heard the night before. The strange part was what happened next. The trail led into the woods but ended abruptly about 20 feet from the tree line. The ground beyond was undisturbed, with no signs of anyone passing through. It was like whoever had been walking around the cabin just vanished. There were no broken branches, no crushed leaves, no flattened grass, nothing. I followed the prints a few more steps, eyes scanning the thick forest. There was no way anyone could have disappeared into thin air. The woods were dense but not impassable. The trail should have continued. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold morning air. My mind raced with possibilities, but none made sense. Was it an animal? No, the prints were definitely human. Someone hiding? But where and why? The cabin was isolated, with no neighbors for miles. If it was someone watching, why not make contact? I checked the cabin carefully, doors, windows, even the chimney for signs of forced entry. Nothing. No fingerprints, no marks, no disturbance inside. I called the owner's number again, but it went straight to voicemail. I packed up some gear and decided to leave a little early. I wanted to get out of that place before something worse happened. Before I left, I looked around the porch one last time. The wood was worn but solid. The hinges were tight. No sign of tampering. The footprints outside were the only clue I had, and the mystery of their sudden disappearance gnawed at me all the way back to the highway. In the weeks after, I told a few friends about what happened. Some said it was probably a hunter or a lost hiker checking the cabin. Maybe, but the locked door, the quiet pacing, and the vanished prints never sat right with me. I never stayed in a cabin that remote again. Not because I'm scared of ghosts or monsters, but because sometimes real things happen in places where no one else is watching, and some things just don't have easy answers.